So here I am now in the Churchill War Rooms. These are the very places, the very rooms from which Churchill conducted World War II. And it's quite surprising. It's not quite what you'd think because it's really just an enhanced basement. With me is Nigel Steele. Hi, Nigel.
Hello.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Because you're the curator of this amazing historic place. And am I right in saying, actually, you'd think it would be 50 foot down, but we're just in a basement.
That's right, 10 foot, that's it, 3 metres. It's a brilliant British story because basically we thought about it too late, we didn't have enough money, and so we did what we could and it was fine. That was basically it. By the end of the 1930s, as the storm clouds of war were rolling all over Europe, they began to get a little bit worried about where was the government going to go, what could they do if war came to London. And there were huge fears about bombing and the devastation that would be wrought across the city instantly. And so the government, very late in the day, started to think about what could it do. It was too late to build a new bunker or something else. They didn't have the money anyway. And so they literally looked around Whitehall for the best basement they could find within good access of the government ministries and number 10 in particular. And this was it.
Yeah, so this amazing building is...
At that time it was called the New Public Offices. It was a new building, had been built end of the 19th century, just about the time of the First World War, over that 20 years. And the reason they liked this one is it had a steel frame. So they thought it was going to be very strong. But what they didn't factor in is the fact that architecturally they built all of these courtyards into it, which were very lovely.
Beautiful.
But if a bomb fell in the middle of it, it meant it was landing on your roof.
Yeah.
So it was weaker than it looked, but the basement was strong. And the other advantage is that they wanted to adapt it in secret. And working down here at that time was the Office of Works. Now they were like the facilities management department for the whole of the government. So if you needed new furniture or you wanted to move something, you went to the Office of Works. So they could do all the work in here and get all the new furniture and everything done in secret because they did it anyway.
Presumably they started planning this then before Churchill actually became Prime Minister.
Oh, it was a couple of years beforehand. So they were looking in May of 1938. So he didn't then become Prime Minister until well into the war, or several months into the war. So when they were looking in the kind of late spring of 1938, they began to realise that war would be coming. And so they looked around, found this basement and started to prepare it so that first the government, the cabinet, could come and meet here, but also the chiefs of staff. So those are the professional heads of the three armed services. They wanted a place where those two bodies could come and work safely and continue working if the bombing of London was very intense. And so this was adapted, just a central section to start with. And what was very handy is that in September 1938, in the Munich crisis, as war became intensely likely, they suddenly thought, oh, we can dress rehearsal it. And so they were able to try it out. And at that time, they found that it wasn't as secure as they wanted it to be, that they didn't have very good ventilation. They needed to make some changes to make it more hospitable. And so in the winter of 1938-39, before the war started, they got 6 months to improve this extemporised space, and that's exactly what they did.
OK, well, let's actually go to a model you've got over here, which shows us exactly where we are and what Churchill must have thought.
So this is a model that we made to show visitors exactly where they are, because once you come downstairs, it's very disorientating.
Yes,
People
very. You
forget
wouldn't know
where they
at
are.
all, would you?
And so this is the Churchill War Rooms at the end of the Treasury building. You get Whitehall running along the top, the River Thames sitting here, and the Houses of Parliament.
There, so Big Ben is here.
Big Ben comes out the
Lovely.
side here. And so we wanted to be able to show people why exactly they'd come downstairs, because people often forget that there was this real threat. And so what you can see here, dotted across the map, are the closest bombs that fell to the Cabinet War Rooms, Churchill War Rooms as we now call them. And so the closest bomb, live bomb, the first one was this one. That fell there on the 20th of September 1940. Gosh. And the second one is here, right at the bottom of King Charles Steps. Today it's the Bali Memorial to the bomb in Bali in 2002. If you stand on that spot, that's exactly where the bomb fell. So those are the two closest bombs.
And do we have any record of what it was like to be here, hearing those bombs fall so close?
Once you were inside the war rooms, you would hear the sound of the bombing upstairs coming through the earth. it didn't really affect you directly. And many of the people who worked here were unaware of exactly what was happening. You will see across the building, there are things to tell you what the weather's like, whether there's an air raid or not, because otherwise you have no idea. You don't know whether it's day or night because everything's blocked off. And so you could sense it, but obviously you couldn't really see it.
But you'd be standing here, you'd hear or something,
Yes.
you'd feel it through the walls, through the earth, and you wouldn't know how close it was or anything.
And the clearest example of that is here, the Guards Chapel. And this was one of the very earliest V1 flying bombs that fell on London, only in the first couple of days. And there were many people killed in the Guards Chapel. But the people who were working on that Sunday here in the Churchill War Rooms could actually feel through the ground this massive explosion reverberating through the earth. They could feel it shaking, so they knew that something pretty catastrophic had taken place.
Yeah, but you wouldn't know how bad or where, or if you knew anyone who might be affected.
But you can see here how close these all come, including these two bombs which land just behind what was then the Treasury, backing onto Whitehall, Treasury Gardens. When you see people coming in and out of number 10 Downing Street, you'll see this little gap just on the side of it. That's the Treasury Gardens. And the bomb dropped just on the Treasury, on the edge of the gardens. It collapsed the back of the Treasury. 2 members of the Treasury Home Guard unit were killed in the basement because it literally just fell on top of them. And a whole number of the windows and the doors were all exploded at the back of number 10. So this was necessary. And really from the middle of September 1940 onwards, until the end of the Blitz in May 1941, Churchill brought his war cabinet down here because they could start the meeting safely and they could carry on and they didn't have to worry about the bombing. So it was regularly used. But once the bombs moved away in May of 1941, he stopped coming down here regularly. And it wasn't until the V1s and the V2s came back in 1944 that it came into its own again for a second run of cabinet.
And those awful rocket bombs were called V. We called them vengeance bombs, but apparently that's what the Germans called them.
That's right.
They were deliberate acts of vengeance.
They were revenge weapons.
For after D-Day.
That's right. They were technology that was part of that great escalating cycle of war. A great, intelligent, kind of innovative technology harnessed just to kill people.
And you can see how Churchill would have actually very much liked the fact that the war rooms were there because his 3 places of work were so close.
That's right.
Did he walk between them? I presume he just did.
Well,
if he had to go and make a speech in the Houses of Parliament, that's where they were. If he had to be in number 10, that was where Downing Street was, so close.
It was very easy to move between them, and so much of this is also connected by tunnel networks. You didn't necessarily have to come out, not to get one from the other. I'm sure he would have been driven from one to the other as well, even in those days.
And at the very end there of the Mall is Buckingham Palace, and that too took a bomb, didn't it?
Yes, nobody was immune. It doesn't matter who you were, where you lived, or whatever it was. This was at risk wherever you went. And throughout the war, this was a place where a bomb could come almost any night when the bombing was underway. So it demonstrates that by coming down here, Churchill needed that continuity. He needed to make sure that if he started a cabinet meeting, he wasn't going to be interrupted. And that's why it's really only a week into the Blitz, from the 16th of September 1940, it becomes a regular place for them all to meet.
Given its importance, was this building really safe enough?
Well, not really. When they took it over in 1938, they made a number of immediate steps. They put in really big wooden timber props. That was the first level of defences they put in. Then after the Munich crisis, they realised it wasn't strong enough, so they put in these red girders that you can see in the ceiling. So these big, thick ones. They only go in some of the rooms because they're so big. But once the Blitz had started, Churchill asked his staff, "Are we safe?" And they said, "Well, not really, Prime Minister." And so he ordered what was called the slab, which meant that in the floor above us, we're in the basement, and the floor above was known as the sub-ground floor. So basically, the sub-ground floor was filled with concrete. And they did this by installing a metal trough, and then they poured about 1.5 meters of concrete onto the metal trough. And you can see here, in the opening up there, the metal trough and the concrete still sitting there. In the building today, you can't go through the sub-ground floor because it's still filled with 1.5 meters of concrete.
Wow.
And so that was what Churchill did. He had poured over the roof of this front part of the building this big 1.5 meters thick of concrete slab to try and give it protection. But the trouble was that technology was such, you're under the pressure of war, that as it got bigger and stronger, everything you did meant that it was no longer still proof against it.
Yes, I mean, I would have thought a floor of concrete still wouldn't be enough, really, would it?
It's not, and what they were worried about is that maybe one of the bombs would come sideways out of the park. So if you look at the outside of the building, you can see another concrete apron that they put in to stop anything coming sideways in the end. In the end, it was never going to be proof against a direct hit from a massive bomb. But it gave the people who worked here the confidence to believe that they were safe enough to carry on with their vital work. There was a esprit de corps for all those who worked here, for the planning committees and the intelligence committees and the secretaries and everybody who was here underground, that they were doing work of huge national importance. And they would put up with that risk that they knew was still there because this was the place they wanted to be because it was so important.
Now this coming up is one of the most important rooms in the entire complex.
The heart of the complex.
Yeah, which is the, what do you call it?
This is the map room.
This is the
so
map
this
room.
is like the beating heart of the whole setup. It was vitally important. Today we take it for granted that information comes to us constantly, particularly on news channels. You know, on a news channel you might get the main story, you get a banner headline,
Yes.
you get breaking news at the bottom. This is the equivalent.
Gosh.
So in 1940-45, this is the analogue version of a digital news channel.
So how was the information coming in? By telephone?
The information came in by telephone from the other war rooms and from other places, intelligence gathering, and it was collated here by this series of map keepers. There were 3 map keepers and a duty officer who sat at the end coordinating the whole show, and they worked in 4 shifts over a 24-hour period. They never stopped. So 24/7 throughout the war, this room operated.
No wonder they look a bit annoyed.
Yes.
They look a bit fed up that we're even asking about them.
It was a very tense place to work because you were expected to be 100% accurate and up to date. And every morning at 9 o'clock, they issued a map room bulletin, which was sent to the highest people, to the King, to the Prime Minister, to the Chiefs of Staff, to the War Cabinet. And that came from here, giving the latest update over the last 24 hours of what was happening in the war. People wanted to be able to come here and get precise and accurate information as exactly what was happening. And that was plotted on all of these maps.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, you've got all the telephones, which have got different colours, which mean what?
The white telephones are direct lines to the war rooms of the other places. The green telephones bringing information in from intelligence gatherers. And the ones where you see them holding, which is the green handset on the black telephone, are scrambler phones. So they were slightly more secure. The signal was scrambled up, but it wasn't totally secure. It's quite easy to break. So it's not high-tech, but it just meant that you were a little bit safer.
So all the bits of information about a world war is coming in here. That's where convoys of ships are, that's where aeroplanes are, that's everything that they could possibly know is coming in on those phones. And then presumably that's what the man at the far end is just actually making it visible.
Yes, you literally, would you update your map so that if the Prime Minister came in and said, what is happening in the war against Japan, they would look at the map and they would be able to see where things had reached.
And there were days when he actually did that, weren't there?
Oh, all the time. No, this was highly advanced, sophisticated information. Churchill's Chief of Staff, Sir Hastings Ismay, said that coming into the map room was like visiting a close friend in hospital. You came up expecting the worst but hoping for the best.
Yeah.
So you came in here not knowing exactly what you were going to get. You didn't know whether the plans you'd put in operation yesterday were going to work, but the way you found out was to come into the map room and ask for the latest information. And so it was vital, and that's why, as I say, it's the heart of the whole establishment. People tend to think of it being where the War Cabinet meet, but actually what really mattered was what was being charted here in this room.
Did the King ever come down here?
The King did come and visit, yes. He was one of the people who was on the list of 40-odd people who were allowed to come in. And so the King certainly does come to the CWR, and he came into the map room.
Because that's the only way you'd know how the war was progressing, really.
That's right. Coming in here and getting the daily bulletin was the only way which you could find out. But this was a hub of information that was run, let's say, from before the war began till literally the last day of the war against Japan.
And what is amazing when you look at all these maps is you realise it really was a world war. There are maps from all over the world here, so everything was being plotted about the globe. But then there are little tiny details. Yeah. There's a story, isn't there, behind those little 3 cubes of sugar, just to the left of the gentleman here.
The sugar lumps that you can see on the side there, they were found by the Imperial War Museum when we were cataloguing the room. When we first took it all over in the early 1980s, we went through everything, and every piece of paper you see in here is listed in our inventory. And in one of the drawers, they found this envelope, and it had 3 sugar lumps in it. Unfortunately, one of the veterans we were talking to was Wing Commander John Hegarty, and he was the last duty officer who was working in here, and this was his sugar ration that he'd been sent, and he used to scrape a bit of sugar off to go in his tea every day so he could make it eke out on the weeks that he was actually on duty here. And because they literally shut up the shop and walked away, he forgot his sugar lumps. And so we found them here, and he said, oh yes, and explained that they were his. He'd left them in the drawer, and that his wife had sent them to.
That was the last of his ration.
And that was the last of his ration. But he was so pleased that war was over, he wasn't going to notice.
He didn't think.
But that makes a really personal connection.
Yes.
It reminds you that the people who work in here were real people.
Yeah, they were real people who didn't get much time for a break or anything like that. Cup of tea would have been, with a bit of sugar in it, would have been a treat.
Yes.
And they were probably smoking all the time as well. So you can imagine the sort of intense atmosphere.
I think in here it would have been much brighter, the lights would have been on so you could see all the maps, and it's not carefully conserved as we have it today with these low light levels. It would have been very bright, it would have been very intense, the stress levels would have been very high. I mean, you have to remember that as you move the convoy maps, every ship that you move was potentially something that could be sunk and lives could be lost. As you charted the battles going, every movement in a battle involved the death of thousands of people. And so the people who worked here in the map room were very conscious that they were charting great events and they were extremely powerful. And I think it adds to the intensity of working here 24 hours a day and keeping it running and knowing that big decisions depended on you getting it right.
And the last day they were here, that's why the calendars show a certain date. That's why all the clocks are at 5 o'clock, or 5 o'clock, isn't it? That's when they decided, that's enough now, we can move out of here.
The war against Japan was over. It was no longer necessary to keep a track of the war in this sort of way. And so literally, they just shut it. And so what you see here today is exactly as it was closed up at the end of the 15th of August 1945, the day of the Japanese surrender. And pinned to the board over there, on the board over there, are the weather maps for the 15th of August, the last day of operation. The next day, no one came in, no new map. And so it's literally as it was left, and it's been preserved like that ever since. Although we've come through the wall, we've come into the next door space from the map room, and this is Churchill's bedroom.
Churchill's bedroom right next to the map room.
He couldn't get in, but he was just next door. He knew it was there. Churchill was deeply into maps. He was a great map lover, and you can see here on the walls of the bedroom is surrounded by maps, and they're covered with curtains, so that if you were coming to see the Prime Minister and you didn't have the right security clearance, they just closed the curtains.
My goodness. But he wanted the maps in his bedroom.
Yes, and he had his own map room. Churchill was given this bedroom in the summer of 1940. He was allocated to him because by then it was a spare room. But he didn't use it that much because he also had a complete flat where he and his wife Clementine lived 2 floors up here, so what was the ground floor of the new public offices, and that was known as the number 10 annex. So for most of the war, that's where they lived, and it was much more comfortable. It had running water. Churchill was somebody who really, really liked 2 baths a day.
Yes, he loved his baths.
He did. It was hugely important to him. So there was no running water down here, so he was never going to like it down here very much. But he did sleep here. But he mostly used it as an office. And if he was working down here during the day, he could come in for his siesta. Because that's the other thing that he did, is that every afternoon he would get undressed back into a nightshirt and he would go to sleep flat out for at least an hour. And then he'd get up, and that's when he'd have his second bath.
Yeah, I mean, he was a very peculiar man for doing that, wasn't he?
But in his late 60s, it kept him going, and he could be up till 3, 4 in the morning, watching movies, talking, drinking. And people who lived a normal life, where they got up early in the morning and then wanted to go to bed at about 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, will be absolutely exhausted. But he'd still be going strong. He'd then take the papers, go to bed, but he wouldn't get up till about 8 or 9 in the morning. Then he'd work in bed, smoke a cigar, maybe a little weak whiskey and water. Then he'd get up and he'd have his bath at about 10:30 and get dressed and then set off for the day. But he'd done a batch of work already.
He was very well known, wasn't he, for sort of dictating letters from his bath or from his bed.
Yes.
Did that happen here?
It would have, if he'd slept in here, that was likely he would have had to do that here. Yeah. But it certainly would have happened upstairs in the number 10 annex. But the 2 or 3 times that he did use this as a room at the height of the Blitz, he was never very comfortable. He didn't like hiding in what he thought was downstairs. He felt that was a bit cowardly. So he liked to be further up where he was still a bit exposed.
But interestingly, I mean, half of it's an office. It's quite a cosy bed the area here, but there's sort of an office idea there, the telephone and microphones.
Yes.
Broadcasting microphones.
Yes, you could hook up live to the BBC from in here. The reason that they're in this room is that when the Cabinet War Rooms was first developed, this was the first Cabinet Office. So they thought the Prime Minister might be broadcasting from within the Cabinet Office, but they kept the equipment in the room when it became Churchill's bedroom. And we know that he gave at least 4 of his famous broadcasts from here in the room. And the other person who used it was Clementine, because she gave a number of speeches in support of the Aid to Russia Fund, of which she was the patron and promoted a great deal. So broadcasts were made here from within the room throughout the war. And so it wasn't just a bedroom or an office, it was somewhere where people could come and talk and live and kind of just fill their day.
Yeah, it just shows he wasn't just this sort of grand figure overseeing a war. He was intimately involved with every part of the fabric of the war.
Absolutely. He lived it 100%. And in the middle of the air raids, within this building, he liked to go right up onto the top of the roof, stand out on the exposed roof and watch the bombs falling, because then he could really monitor what was going on. He was a fearless man. He believed he had a destiny, and his destiny wasn't going to be hit by a bomb in the Blitz. So he was confident and able to set aside the kind of fears that other people would have found overwhelming. And within his big personality, that's one of the ways in which he was able to demonstrate that kind of strength and charisma, which then inspired everybody else.
And now, Nigel, we come to the smallest room in the house,
yes,
basically, but it's got quite a story.
It's got a big story, yes. This is very important. It was disguised like everything else here. This was disguised as Churchill's toilet. If you look at the door on the outside, it's got one of those vacant engage locks, because when they put this very secret technology in here, they wanted to make sure that no one even thought of coming in. So they pretended it was the only working toilet in the building on this level. Of course, there was no running water on this level, but it was all just a fiction.
Because I'd always heard the story that Churchill used to ring Roosevelt from his toilet.
That was disguised as that, that's right, yes. But when Churchill and Roosevelt first developed their relationship earlier in the war, they could use a transatlantic telephone, but it was very insecure. And so their phone calls were monitored, and the censor would make sure they weren't talking about anything sensitive. So most of their important conversation was done through telegrams and through other means of communication. But during the war, the Americans developed this highly technologically sophisticated digital way of encoding telephone signals that could not be broken. And what's amazing today is when you look back on this is technology that begins to come together from 1940 onwards and is fully developed by 1943 when they can install it here in London. What's amazing is that it's the precursor of the digital technology we take for granted today.
In the 1940s?
Absolutely. I mean, if you think of today of when you just speak out loud and say, hey Siri, or ask Alexa, that same technology of the voice speaking to you is basically the basis of this, because what the Bell Telephone Company did is they developed a way of digitizing the human voice. So they would take a voice sound and they would break it up into a digital signal, and they would then add to that a random noise. And once it was all mixed together, it was impossible to break it open. It was then transmitted across the Atlantic, and at the other end, they would extract exactly the same noise at exactly the same time. And that would leave a clear signal that could then be fed digitally into basically a voice synthesizer, a vocoder. And that would then speak the answer at the other end. So it was like having a telephone conversation, but it was all digital. And the extension that Churchill used was installed here. The main kit was underneath Selfridge's department store. It took a massive basement to hold these big racks of digital technology, all of these racks of valves and things that took the signal and broke it up. They had to put it in 2 levels down of the basement, underneath and behind Selfridge's basement. And so this was an extension from there. This was also highly secretive. The whole thing was totally unknown. The Americans held on to their secret technology very, very tightly.
So all of the people who worked here, when they saw Churchill go into the room there, the smallest room, they thought he was going to the toilet.
They would have done.
And he was probably on a top top secret phone call to Roosevelt.
That's right. Nobody would have known what he was going and what they were saying. But it was a difficult thing to achieve because you had to balance this one up. In order to put the random noise on it, they had these big discs, these vinyl discs, that they had to start playing at exactly the right point here as where it was being received in the United States. The same sound at the same point in order to be able to put in the random noise and take it out again. So this was not something where you could just randomly pick up the phone and say, hey, Mr. President. So you had to book yourself in, you had to get a slot, you had to get it all done. So when they were speaking, this was highly important.
And supposedly, these were the phone calls where Churchill was practically begging America to come into the war, almost begging, doing anything that he could do.
The messages that they passed through here, they had to be very careful about to begin with. Once they could actually say what they liked, they could speak more freely. And so by the end of the war, they were able to be much more candid than they could be at the beginning.
So Nigel, this room looks awfully important.
It is. This is the one that visitors come to and think of most when they're thinking of the Churchill War Rooms. This is the cabinet room. So this is the one that was set up from the beginning of the war for the cabinet to meet in when the bombing became intense. And in fact, that's exactly what they did. From the middle of September 1940, this became the place where Churchill held these war cabinet meetings. But as well as that, there were defence committee meetings. And you can see 3 chairs lined up here.
Yes.
And that's where the chiefs of staff, so the heads of the Army, the Navy and the Air Force would sit directly opposite the Prime Minister.
Because this is Churchill's chair,
This is
clearly,
Churchill's chair,
Yeah.
sitting in the middle, the only chair in the room that is different.
Yes.
And so the Prime Minister sits here at the head of the table, and facing him directly are the 3 chiefs of staff. And I think this is almost like a metaphor. It's certainly a reflection of the way in which democracy works, because they were leading the armed services. So Churchill couldn't send soldiers, sailors and airmen directly into action, but he had to persuade them. But it was their job to stop him from doing anything crazy.
Yes.
And so the dialogue and the tension between them, which is directly reflected in the layout of the table, is exactly why the democratic process of discussion and agreement and consensus works.
Well, so these on the outside would have been politicians,
Yes.
his war cabinet,
Yes.
which was cross-party.
It was. Sitting here
Yeah.
on the left of Churchill was Clement Attlee,
My
who effectively
goodness.
became the de facto Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And sitting on his right was Sir Edward Bridges, who was the Cabinet Secretary. So that was what surrounded Churchill and placed him here at the head of the table. And other people would have been members of the War Cabinet. Other people often were invited to come to specific meetings to talk about a set subject. And so it was often a very busy place. And the other thing within here is we look at all the lights, although it's dim and the light is quite low. This would have been a very intensive place again, and all of these people would have been smoking.
Yes, I mean, there's ashtrays everywhere.
Ashtrays everywhere.
So it would have been full of smoke and politics and argument and those 3 very important men running the hard line of the war.
Yes.
But this man making the decisions.
Absolutely, and how hard that was is shown by the fact that on the arms of this chair, the chair that Churchill sat in, you can see ingrained on the 2 ends are marks on the chair. And on the right-hand side, it's where he had a signet ring on his right hand, and he would bang it in frustration and tension as he was chairing the meetings. And on the other side, it's said to be from his fingernails.
Gosh,
and so
he's worn holes in the wooden arms of his chair.
it's absolutely a reflection of the strength of the personality of the man who sat in the chair. And I think when we look at this and we say, what exactly was it that Winston Churchill brought to the table, literally, in 1940 as Prime Minister? It's that charisma, it's that belief, it's that radiance of power. And that quality, which the nation picked up on and which he used to carry everybody forward, is literally driven into the chair.
It is absolutely. Yes, you get a feeling of the strength of the man and the width of the chair and the importance of the chair.
Yes.
It's all part of the whole passion.
Absolutely fits.
It's a play almost, except that this was life and death as well.
Yes.
And all of those major decisions would have been taken here.
I think the other thing about this room that always interests me is the map behind us, because it reminds you of the mindset of all the people who sat around the table.
Yes.
You can
Everybody
see
with their own specific interests.
Great Britain, right at the heart of the world.
Great Britain's in the centre, isn't it?
Probably twice as big as it should be.
Yes.
But it radiates again that sense of complete confidence that Britain and the empire, which you can see spread around in the pink colour on the map, was going to be a power that would not be defeated and would be able to gather its strength and come back in order to defeat the tyranny that was rising out of Europe.
Do we know how often they met here?
In this room, we know that they met here 116 times.
Gosh.
Not every time, because once the bombs stopped coming, they met elsewhere above ground. But they came here in 1940-41 during the Blitz, and they came again in 1944-45 when the V1 and the V2 bombs started falling on London. So at that time, this was a highly important place.
Yeah.
And big decisions were taken and discussions were had here in this place. And it's what's amazing is to think that within this vast smoky atmosphere, you can see the piping along the top, which looks like it's bringing fresh air, but all it was piped air that came from Horseferry Road. There was a pump there.
Ordinary air.
Ordinary air, polluted London air,
Yeah.
sucked in, sent through a metal pipe for about best part of a mile. And when it came out here, people would say if you took out a white handkerchief and put it in the vents, when you took it out, it would be black. And so it wasn't doing much for the quality of the air inside this room.
No.
And yet that's the way in which they all sat and debated these issues, sometimes heatedly, sometimes in agreement, sometimes in
But
disagreement.
what always stuns me is that we can look back on it now because history tells us what happened. But they didn't know what was going to happen.
No, there were issues of literally national life and death at stake here. And they were debated in the room and then fed back out through the process. So Churchill would do it politically, and the chiefs of staff would then send things down through the chain of command, so that decisions taken in this room directly affected the lives of the ordinary people living in Britain and on the front line.
And Churchill, when he spoke to people, particularly through his major speeches, said that it would be a matter of blood, sweat, toil and tears. And you wonder whether he really believed we would prevail.
Oh, I think 100%. The whole time, that was it. There were moments of doubt where he got tired, where he doubted, where he wondered how he would do it. But I think it was that utter conviction that at the end of the day, they had to win. We had to succeed. We had to come forward, which was that quality that he projected. When he became Prime Minister in May 1940, he really had no reason to believe that Britain was in a position to win. But he just believed so strongly that we had to, and in our national character and that of the people of the empire, that he gathered all of that. He made everybody else believe at those difficult times. And that's the quality that I think he brought to the war, and which he kind of projected and injected into the people.
If you compare it to situation rooms we see nowadays, underneath the White House or goodness knows where they are in our country or countries elsewhere, they are massive. There are computer screens everywhere. There's information being fed in from all over the world. This strikes you as quaint, and yet the personalities around this table weren't quaint. No. They were massive personalities.
This was the kind of state of the art at the time. You can see the three tables around. These would have had the male secretaries would have been sitting at this table, taking down the minutes. And the reason why they would have three of them is so that each element of discussion on the agenda, when they finished that, they could send it off and start getting the minutes typed. And so that was the way in which they kept up the momentum. They were so important. It may look to us today like an old-fashioned kind of analogue way of doing business, but at the time, this was state of the art.
It was, yeah. And it is incredible to be able to come in and breathe the same air, I guess, you feel you are, and to look at all of the bits and bobs, the half-chewed cigar, the pencil and paper, and the red box, of course.
The red box, which kind of reminds you of the government that he was a part of. And you can see also little things that are very Churchillian, as well as the cigar. They have what was known as a clop. Churchill had a hatred of of staples.
Yeah.
He thought he was going to prick his finger, so he wouldn't have staples to staple his papers together. He insisted on old-fashioned treasury tags, the bit of string with the two ends.
Yes.
And so to make a hole, you have the clop,
yes,
because it makes that noise, plop. When he made the hole in the corner, you would then collect your papers
Well,
together.
he had lots of idiosyncrasies, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
I mean, we talked about the bath, how he loved his baths. Apparently, even World War I, he even took a bath to the trenches with him.
That's where he took a mountain of luggage when he went to the trenches.
Absolutely. Yes. But he was this very old-fashioned man who, at the age of what, was conducting the war?
65.
65.
He was in his mid-60s, mid to late 60s throughout the war. So it was quite incredible, really, the energy that he displayed in this rather eccentric and I think absolutely exhausting lifestyle. Exhausting for everybody else who had to keep up with it.
Yes.
But nevertheless, he thrived upon it. And thank goodness he did, because to keep going and maintain that sense of conviction and belief in what he was actually doing.
But he believed. He
Absolutely.
believed since he was a little boy, that one day he would save the world, or certainly Britain.
Well, that's right. He believed that his time would come. And most people, by the beginning of the Second World War, in his position, would have thought that the moment had passed. But he was still waiting. And when the moment came, he was ready for it.
I noticed there isn't a glass of whiskey or anything. Did he not drink in front of everybody?
There's a carafe of water.
Yes.
But I would have thought within the cabinet was probably a place where he was focused on the day's business.
I'm sure.
He knew he would get a drink afterwards, and that was probably where they went. The clocks are all set at 2 minutes to 5.
Yes.
And that's because all the clocks around the place are, if this is a moment in time, set for the 15th of October, 1940. Because on the day before, a bomb had fallen very close to Downing Street. And it's one of these rare moments of Churchillian inspiration intervention. He'd been holding a dinner party, and his cook, Mrs. Landermere, had been cooking the dinner when the air raid sirens went off. So Churchill took his guests down to the bomb shelter at number 10, but he realised his personal staff hadn't gone with him. And so as the raid went on, and he's got this sense of danger growing, he went upstairs and he insisted on Mrs. Landermere that she had to come down to the bomb shelter. And she said, but the sauce will ruin. He said, never mind the sauce, everybody has to come downstairs. And at that point, a bomb dropped on Treasury Gardens, broke all the windows, caused extensive damage in number 10, and could well have seriously injured or even killed his personal staff had he not taken them down to the basement. And that is the moment at which you realise the threat which exists over ground. And so Imperial War Museum set the scene across the camera just for that particular moment. And so it captures it. It's 2 minutes to 5. Churchill is about to arrive for the meeting here in this room. And we want visitors to come and see that what it felt like, what that sense was of this whole area at that moment of great tension and peril for the
Because
nation.
war wasn't just about statistics, countries, armies. It was about people at the end of the day.
Yes.
And that just shows his understanding of the fact that it's about people, individuals.
Yes, his connection and understanding with people, and that's the special quality that he has on all these occasions. Controversial as he may be in many different areas, he was nevertheless somebody who at those times could do things where you'd think that's what makes him a great man.
It's an amazing story and it's an amazing place. Thank you so much, Nigel,
been a real pleasure.
for telling us all about it. It's absolutely fascinating place to visit. It really is. You must get so much reaction from people like me who've seen it for the first time.
That's right. It's always a thrill throughout the museum, but particularly this site, which is so powerful to be able to bring people and really connect them with those vital moments of history within the British nation.
Yeah, you can feel it. Thank you so much.